My name is David Thomas, and for some reason I got roped into joining the Sierra Club Executive Committee, and we got a grant a year ago for a program called Nearby Nature, and that's the Great Waters Nearby Nature program, and I'll be talking a little bit about that and explaining if it's new to you. But I'd especially like to welcome our panel. We've got a really awesome group of people here today. Starting with August Ball. August is the founder and director of Cream City Conservation, and I'm going to talk a little bit more when she's ready to come up. Yamile Salgado is a student at Escuela Verde, and Martha Berry is the racial justice director for YWCA. Was that close enough, everyone? So anyway, a year ago we had a program called Environmental Justice Matters, and that. So I was just going to do a little quick recap for those of you who weren't here a year ago. We outlined a little bit about what the Nearby Nature program is and how the Great Waters Group is taking initiative on justice and equity issues. It's kind of a National Sierra Club initiative as well, which I'll talk a little bit more about. But one thing that definitely came out of it and out of the Nearby Nature program is that we're acknowledging that there's a very vibrant environmental movement exists in Milwaukee's Black community. We're focusing on the 30th Street corridor and the Lincoln Creek Greenway, and so it's not surprising to anyone, and especially if you research the statistics on it, and we might have more about it later, but in communities of color, people of color support environmental protections at a higher rate than white folks do when you start doing surveys. So one of the crowning achievements, I think, of the Nearby Nature program has been our partnership with Urban Ecology Center to bring environmental education programs into youth-serving agencies. And we started last spring partnering with the Boys and Girls Club, the Daniel Smardak Boys and Girls Club on 35th and Hampton. And then in the summer, we added Samuel Clemens School, which is an MPS program that they have an after school and a summer camp program. And then we also partnered with Lighthouse Youth Center, which is in Garden Homes neighborhood. It's a faith-based organization. And then in the fall, we could only manage to, in our partnership with Urban Ecology Center, we went back down to 2 centers. And now we're continuing in the spring, and if the funding holds up, we'll continue into the summer. But if we're able to raise money, there are probably a half a dozen other schools and agencies along that Lincoln Creek Greenway that are interested in developing environmental programs, and so we have hopes for expanding it. Some of the other accomplishments we've had in the last year, we've really partnered with a lot of organizations to do all of these things. We didn't do anything by ourselves. And I'm always telling people that this work is all about building relationships and seizing opportunities. And so we're always looking for opportunities to partner and do things with different groups. Speaking of partnerships, we have a group of organizations, we consider them strategic partners, such as the Urban Ecology Center. They have such a wealth of experience in doing environmental education. I don't think anybody should do anything around environmental education in this city without being aware of what the Urban Ecology Center is doing. The Northwest Side Community Development is the second acronym up there. They're a Northwest Side community agency that has been very supportive and crucial in helping us develop partnerships with block clubs and neighborhood organizations, for example, such as the Garden Homes folks. Milwaukee Metropolitan Sewerage District they manage a lot of the green space in the Lincoln Creek corridor. It's kind of a combination of county parks and city property, but a lot of it is managed by the Milwaukee Metropolitan Sewage District. And they are very active in doing community outreach as well, and for a brief period, funded about half of the youth programs that we were doing. Then Havenwood State Forest and Lincoln Park are on opposite ends of Lincoln Creek Greenway, and so those are really important partners to us. So we've got some folks from Friends of Lincoln Park here. And then we have, who here is from Riverkeeper? Clean Wisconsin's been a really important partner. And the list goes on, and particularly Clean Wisconsin and Water Commons, Milwaukee Water Commons. Oh, fantastic. Milwaukee Water Commons and Clean Wisconsin have been real mentors for us, I should say, in doing this multicultural, cross-cultural kinds of work, and we've learned a great deal from them. So essentially in 2018, we tried to develop a consistent presence in the community by showing up and being there, develop relationships with all these agencies and organizations, block clubs, community groups, and hopefully I've learned a lot that we can build on in the future for doing this cross-community work. Personally, I feel I have a lot to learn. I'm just kind of dipping my toes in this water right now in terms of understanding how to deal with issues of cultural differences when you're going into a community where people don't look like you, but expecting to be welcomed and but showing up is an important part of that. I approached Venus Williams from Alice's Garden. A lot of you probably know Alice's Garden, and she's very, very respected in the environmental movement. I said, Venus, what can I do? And she said, well, why don't you come down to yoga every Tuesday night? And so I have to confess it did make a huge difference in terms of making me feel more comfortable. And one day I walked into a meeting of the Villard Avenue Business Development District and asked if I could interrupt and just hand out an announcement about our river cleanup, and the woman looked up and said, oh, I saw you at yoga. So little things like that. Knowing when to stop talking and listen. Sometimes people of color don't feel comfortable speaking up in front of a white audience, and so you have to make a point to give them an opportunity to speak, or even stop and check in. It's not, it doesn't always happen. Just because the door is open doesn't mean people are going to come in and feel comfortable. So, and understanding about white privilege and white supremacy. I took Martha's class at the YWCA, which I highly recommend. It's an intensive 6-week class on unlearning racism and really learning tools and resources. And if you didn't see it, there's a resource list over here, and I should point that out. There are a couple handouts here. Besides our newsletter, the Urban Ecology Center has an environmental film series in Washington Park. And then we also have a resource list of readings and recommended books and websites, Facebook pages, things that everybody should look at to get a better understanding of white privilege and white supremacy, and how we get up every morning and the world looks normal to us. It's, we don't feel out of place. We don't feel like the other. and we don't think about race, but we need to, and understand how that racial issue affects other people. And that personal reflection, it's a long journey, it's a lifelong journey. I'm going to talk a little bit about the Sierra Club, and something happened with my fonts that you can make out. It's founded by wealthy white men so that they could go out and hang out in the woods and the wilderness in the areas around San Francisco, and what's now Yosemite Park, I believe, and felt they needed to organize to protect those areas, to protect those national areas, so white wealthy men could continue to enjoy them. And fast forward to 1970, my mother worked for the YWCA, and I can remember in 1970 when she came home and she was all excited about this initiative that the YWCA announced they were going to put an end to racism. And it didn't happen overnight, it's still going on. And the struggle even internally in the YWCA wasn't a one-time declaration. There was a lot of struggle over it. And in the Sierra Club as well, in 1972, just for comparison, the Sierra Club pulled its membership and decided that their members weren't really concerned about environmental justice. And so in 1990, the Southwest Organizing Project, which was an organization of Native American and Hispanic environmental groups, sent a letter to the large environmental organizations, including the Sierra Club, saying, I'm sorry, but you really don't have any reason to come down here and do environmental work when your boards are entirely white. You need to get your own house in order and come to grips with this diversity issue, and don't come here pretending like you know what's needed in our community. And so it was a wake-up call for the environmental movement, and things have gradually changed since then. In the Jemez Principles, that's something you have to look up. But it's basically a set of principles that have to do with diversity and inclusion. And this picture of Aaron Mayer, who was the elected president of Sierra Club and served a term and has moved on. But there are still efforts going on in the Sierra Club to transform through this process that they call theory of change. And this is just a quick example from some of the documents that are circulating. The number one goal is to reduce barriers and expand access to outdoor areas, and making sure that outdoor areas are welcome to everybody, and that we connect people to nature close to home, nearby nature. This is a little bit more detail. It's a little bit too much detail. But just highlighted some things. This is one paragraph out of a 10-page document, but the Sierra Club owns up to its supporting the system of oppression. And the Sierra Club admits that they've advocated for federal policies in wild lands to the direct harm of Native American communities. We haven't done enough to make sure that our national parks and state parks and green areas are welcoming to those outside our historically white middle class and upper middle class demographic. And so, and then they talk about building authentic relationships, which is totally what I believe in, building relationships and seizing opportunities. So, this is some of the things that I feel we need to do locally and nationally is invest in training. We're not going to succeed going into communities as missionaries. We need to learn how to be allies and how to behave in that situation. As an example, I've run into events and organizations where, in the African American community, where they don't necessarily welcome white people in. Well, you know, what's going on with that? Well, they explained to me that this is an event where they need to feel comfortable, and my presence there wouldn't make them feel comfortable. And sometimes things like that happen. Anyway, I'm going to focus just for a couple of minutes on Milwaukee. This is a study that was done by Rails to Trails, called the Bikeable Study of Opportunity, Equity, and Connectivity. And if you haven't seen this, I recommend Googling Reconnecting Milwaukee. And this is just one slide from that study about demographics in the central city in high poverty areas, and getting an understanding of whether or not people have access to trails or not. And the Rails to Trails Conservancy is working to try and build a Rails with Trails system up through the 30th Street corridor. It's going to be a long-term project, but they started with this study to show that in the central city, both on the north side and the south side, there really is a lack of access to trails. And I saw a map of our famous Oak Leaf Trail system. Everybody is and should be proud of our Oak Leaf Trail system that the Milwaukee County Park manages. But if you look at the map, there's a big circle around the central city and about the near south side. There's no connections to that trail for lots and lots of acres.
Ted Cruz said.
So, Milwaukee, of course, is famous for beer and segregation. And so we have a community that's traumatized in all these areas. African Americans do not achieve the income levels. They suffer from lower educational achievement and opportunities, less home ownership, healthcare, transportation, access to outdoor recreational opportunities. The only things that they have more of is more infant mortality and young male incarceration rates. And so just when I look at this sort of thing, it kind of puts into perspective for me what white privilege means, is that we don't have to deal with these things and think about them every day. We start out on a couple of rungs up the ladder. Just the fact that we're alive is because our communities have better rates of infant mortality. It's just something to consider. So, so this is just my personal reflection, but I read an article recently about slavery didn't end, it just evolved. And when you think about Reconstruction and Jim Crow in the South, and even during the Great Migration of black folks to the north, there were more sundown laws in northern communities than there were in southern communities, from what I'm told. Even in the FDR years, there was federal legislation limiting where African Americans could live and own homes. That housing segregation that's played out really well in a book called The Color of Law. So whose problem is this? And when I look at, well, who's in charge? You know, for years, Martin Luther King led marches, multicultural white and black people fighting for voting rights and all of this. But the American community, when people accuse them of not picking up their trash or causing these problems or not doing enough to pull themselves up by their bootstraps. This is what I call blaming the victim. And my last reflection is, I think Martha brought her copy of White Fragility, a book that all of us should read and get over it. So anyway, this is my last slide, and the Nearby Nature Project is kind of in flux right now. We had a one-time grant from the Sierra Club. We're just about out of money. We need to start raising money, and so we established a relationship with Milwaukee Environmental Consortium, and that's still kind of under construction. I'm hoping by the end of February we'll have everything figured out and we can start doing some grant writing. But this is how we define our mission as we move into that next phase. That we're celebrating in the environmental movement in communities of color, and we're still focusing on the Lincoln Creek Greenway and the corridor, but addressing that systematic racism in our own movement is a really important part of that. So, at this time, I'm going to introduce August Ball. And August Ball, I mentioned earlier, she's the founder of Queen City Conservation. It's a dual, two-pronged social enterprise. The first part is Queen City Conservation Consulting, and she works with community service organizations and environmental groups to address internal cultures and practices that contribute to a homogeneous workforce. But the organization also has another side to it, which is the Queen City Conservation Corps, which works with a young adult, 15 to 24 years of age, who are traditionally unrepresented in various conservation and urban agriculture and green infrastructure industries. So I believe it's mostly a summer employment program, but she's going to correct me on this. And August has degrees from UW Parkside, or got her education through UW Parkside and UW Milwaukee, but is also very much self-taught as an environmentalist. And let's welcome August Ball.
Good evening, everyone. Thank you so much for spending your night with us. All right, so yeah, just to kind of, I guess, qualify why I'm in front of you tonight. David is correct. We are a two-pronged social enterprise. I am, by all intents and purposes, an accidental social entrepreneur. I thought I would spend my last days on this earth working for nonprofits, and we make our plans and life laughs. So our social enterprise does do consulting work with environmental organizations predominantly, but we also work with community-based organizations that want to address their racial homogeneity within their organization. And then we use those proceeds to fund our environmental conservation programs, which essentially train and engage young people of color predominantly in environmental career pathways. So we have a few different programs. We have our Conservation Corps program, which works directly with Milwaukee County Parks, doing invasive species removal, wetland surveys. We also have an urban agriculture program. We do, sorry, let me back up a little bit here. We also have a green infrastructure program, which is a partnership with MMSD, the Milwaukee Metropolitan Sewerage District. This is intended to connect, again, young people, predominantly of color, and other folks with underrepresented identities in environmental engineering, in water quality career pathways. And And then we also have our urban agriculture program, which is a partnership with UW-Milwaukee and Milwaukee Public Schools and Employ Milwaukee. One of my favorites of this urban agriculture program is actually that the students get to grow their food, their produce, they sell it to area restaurants, that money goes right back into the program. And I don't know if I don't have a picture of it here, but if any of you are Brewers fans and you're going to a Brewer game this season, check out a stall that's called Roots for the Home Team. Those are typically going to be our students. They're selling salads with the produce that they grew themselves and that they created and designed and named. So they're very proud of their salads. And who doesn't want teenagers excited about salads? And right? And Yuli, this is one that I say is my favorite part about not being a nonprofit, is that we get to do political advocacy work around climate action. So we have a partnership with the Alliance for Climate Education, and we engage young people ages 14 to 20 in political advocacy around environmental science, getting them to use relational voter turnout practices to get their friends and family members to vote for politicians who actually care about our environment and want to implement more equitable and inclusive practices that protect our earth and keep us healthy. So, I'm actually here tonight to talk to you all about why our green organizations are still predominantly white and what we can do about it. So before I get into that, however, I want to address a couple myths. And I want to do that because there are a couple perspectives that keep us from even unpacking this work in a way that's useful, I guess, we'll call it that. So the first myth is that people of color just aren't interested in working for our organizations. And if they are interested, they're not qualified. Well, I think that if we believe people of color are not interested in working for our organization, if they're not interested in the environment, and they don't have the skills and the academic background for these jobs, then those aren't going to be the types of people we're going to seek out and recruit and attract and promote within our organization. So I want you to humor me for a moment, and I want you to think about what you think the number one way organizations recruit talent is. What would you say it is? People they know, right? Referrals, right? Over 90% of organizations hire people through referrals. So take a moment and think about the top 5 people you spend the most amount of time with who are not related to you, preferably. So not your significant other, ideally not your children or your family members, but outside of that, just if you can only think of 3, just think of 3. But get those names in your head, okay? And when you have those 3 to 5 names in your head, just give me a little church point. So let me know you've got your folks. Yeah, just hold up there so I know everyone's going, okay, you got your people? Awesome. So now, think about those people and think about what's their gender identity or expression. What's their race or ethnicity? What's their age? Their sexual orientation? Their educational attainment level? Do they have a disability or not? What's their marital status? Or what's their caregiver status? Right? Do they care for an ailing parent, or are they a parent themselves? So think about those things. How similar are those demographics to you? So that's a problem with referrals, right? We like people who are like us. It's not a problem. It's actually a very normal human response, and that goes back to tribal periods, right? Where there's safety and sticking with people who are like you. Unfortunately, like many other things, we haven't evolved enough as a society to recognize that we don't necessarily need to do that anymore, again, depending on your personal identity in this world. But if we rely primarily on referrals when we're looking for people to join our organizations, and our networks are predominantly homogenous, you kind of see the problem there, right? We end up with clones of ourselves. So that's one myth that I want to address. The next is that there's a really big disconnect between what environmental organizations say they value and what they're actually putting resources behind. So, for example, if I believe that my organization is already equitable and already fair, and everyone who should be here is here, and everybody who wants to be here is here, well, then I'm not going to take a very critical lens to my hidden culture, to my unspoken practices, to my policies, to evaluate whether or not I'm making decisions that are unduly benefiting and unduly burdening certain demographic groups. This right here is proof that we know that people of color are not only interested in these careers, they do at some point get into organizations. The problem, however, is that we can't keep them. So this is taken directly from the Green 2.0 report. And I suggest that if you identify as anyone who cares about the environment, that is a report that you should be reading. The newest one just came out in January. But we'll see here that with nonprofits, government agencies, and foundations, these are the percentage of people of color in their organization from an internship level. Then we go into who was hired in the past 3 years. Then we go into leadership. Then we go into board slots. So as you can see, as we progress in our organizations, we often find a lot of diversity at that frontline level. The receptionist, right? Maybe the educator who works with children. But as we go further up in the organization, as the more power each of those positions hold, we find that the more white and the more male it gets. And actually, despite all of the efforts that have been made in the past few years around inclusion, these numbers have actually gotten worse. Now I can speculate on why that has happened over the past few years, but that'd be a whole nother workshop. So, all right. So the next myth is that diversity is a euphemism for people of color. When I used to work for the Student Conservation Association, one of our development directors would write grants stating how diverse our Milwaukee program was. The problem with that is that our program was over 80% self-identified as Black. So not diverse, it's actually pretty racially homogenous. So it got me thinking, why don't we just say what we mean? Why don't we just say that we want to attract people of color in our organizations, right? The other issue about using diversity as a euphemism for people of color is twofold. One is that it promotes the erroneous assumption that diversity means the exclusion of whites. It also promotes the notion that, actually, we backtrack. I think one of the number one reasons that people who identify as white perhaps struggle with conversations around race is because many folks who identify as white don't see themselves racialized. I often joke that I am part Black, part Choctaw Native, and regular. Because we have this notion that, to be white is the baseline, and everything else is like the additional seasoning to our stir fry. And, that's really problematic when you think about it. David alluded to, to certain spaces not necessarily being for you as a white person. And I can tell you as a person of color, a lot of that is connected to the assumption that whiteness is the baseline and that white emotions and feelings must be catered to at all times, right? Even way of being, the way you present yourself should be, of this very Anglo-Saxon assumption. And sometimes people of color just need a space where they don't have to worry about catering to white people's feelings. I know that sounds really heavy, but I need you to hear me with this. And I understand that for many of you, you're probably hearing this for the first time. And that's okay, and that discomfort that you're feeling right now, you're probably feeling that because as a white person, you probably haven't spent your whole life having conversations about race. Whereas for many people of color, our whole lives revolve around navigating conversations about race and difference. So that's one aspect of white fragility, where you simply haven't been able to build that muscle. I realized that teaching other people how to have conversations about difference wasn't that I had some great PhD in this work. It was because I grew up in a family with a Catholic mother, a Jewish father. I tell people I'm a cashew all the time. Being multi-ethnic, having a brother that's Mormon. We're an interesting bunch. But I realized that not everybody grows up navigating that kind of difference so close to home. And that's okay. I get that I'm an anomaly, but the key is realizing that you don't have to be wrong, I don't have to be right, but we also have to understand that we all have blinders and we all have certain life experiences that inform how we view the world. And my favorite part about this work is helping people come together where they can not see differences in opinion as opposition, but rather as information, and not view that as a burden necessarily. The key, though, is for us to be aware of where our blind spots are, rather than trying to convince someone that they don't see what they actually see, or they're not feeling what they're actually feeling. You feel me? Okay. So, as I mentioned, let me go back for a minute. Oftentimes, the culture of people of color is also conflated with poverty culture, and in my personal opinion, that's a very lazy way of hiking around some of the more rockier points of racism and discrimination. It's also a very convenient way to filter people of color out of a job applicant pool. So, again, diversity is not synonymous with people of color. In the same breath, though, diversity is not just the differences among us, right? People love to say, we all breathe the same, and we all breathe the same air, and in fact, actually, we don't. I wouldn't even get into that. Again, this doesn't mean that this isn't true, it's just not the point, right? The point is that diversity is the unique differences between us based on how we experience the world, based on how we're treated in society, right? Raise your hand really high if you are familiar with what's called a racially restrictive covenant. A racially restrictive covenant. Okay, awesome. There's more here than my usual audience, so that's great. So basically, many of us were led to believe that our city is so segregated, many cities are segregated, because people like to live with people who are like them, right? So we have, the Polish community over here, and the Mexican community over here, and the Black community here. That's by design. So up until 1968, before we had the Fair Housing Act, people of color were not permitted to purchase homes in certain areas, like Washington County, Ozaukee County, Cudahy, Franklin, right? What's that? Elm Grove, absolutely. And even though that sort of practice was outlawed in '68, we know that just because something becomes against the law doesn't mean we automatically have this change of heart overnight. We're like, oh, it's all good now, right? In fact, if we were to overlay a map of Milwaukee along with a redlining map, which is basically redlining is simply a little map that says, here's where you don't go, you can't get a mortgage here, right? And where do most of us Americans get our wealth from? generation, our homes, right? My father got a GI, or a veteran loan, or a GI loan, I don't know. My dad's old as dirt, I love him, but when he came back, he could not, that loan was essentially useless because he couldn't, as a Black Jewish man, he could not purchase homes in certain areas. So imagine when we talk about how we just need to get over things because X, Y, and Z happened so long ago, we haven't been able to recover from that, right? Because even with the scholarships and the financial aid that was attributed to veterans, if you were only allowed to attend school at certain schools in certain locations, and that wasn't convenient for you and your family, again, that benefit was essentially useless. So anyway, off of my tangent. Another myth I want to just lay to rest is that Black and brown people are too busy being poor to care about the environment. Again, David alluded a little bit to this, that actually people of color care more about the environment when polled than whites. And I have that proof today, right here. So this research was done, I believe it was funded by Nature Conservancy, if I'm not mistaken, but it was polled by Fairbank, Maslin, Mullen and Associates. So when we look here at pollution of rivers, lakes, and streams, we can see that people of color, again, when compared with white voters, stated larger concern. Climate change, toxins and pesticides in our food and drinking water, pollution of our oceans. And actually, I don't have this highlighted, but even loss of working farms, when you look at Latinx communities, and also communities of color as a whole, and there's a whole other reason why that's probably a little bit lower, which again, that's another workshop, we won't get into that today. Yeah, loss of habitat and fish for wildlife, and loss of natural areas. Yes?
I'm just wondering if that correlates with where people live.
Mm-hmm.
Perhaps people who, Black people who live,
Your infirmaries?
yeah,
Mm-hmm.
you know, the air
Mm-hmm.
is worse, or the river is worse than
Mm-hmm.
where white guys go fishing.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. So, I mean, it's easy to think, to have this sense of safety, even for us here in the Midwest, right? It can be challenging for us to think about how climate change, for example, affects us because we're not in the coastal areas, but we're actually seeing an increase in Lyme's disease. We're seeing an increase in poor air quality. We're having hotter summers, which is all correlated to violence, to health issues. So yes, absolutely. And because of that, that false sense of security, it can present this notion that we don't have to worry about that. So you're absolutely right. There's also a lot of indigenous and generational knowledge that is passed down in communities of color that it might not be passed down in the same way that it happens in white families, but it's there. And so, yeah. So speaking of thinking something's not a problem, another area of contention around implementing more equitable practices, I find, for a lot of environmental organizations, is this perception that, well, gosh, August, you're saying that children under the age of 4 right now are 50%, more than 50% youth of color, right? And you're saying that by 2045, over 50% of the population is going to be consisting of people of color. So then if people of color are about to be the majority, we don't need to do anything, right? Like, it's gonna fix itself. Oh, how I wish that were so. We actually don't have to go much further than apartheid to know that just because you are the majority does not actually mean that you will hold the power. We just happen to think that because in our society, typically whites have historically held the most amount of power. The other aspect I want to point out is even how we are engaging in the conversation about our shifting racial demographics. So this is a perfect example of systemic whiteness. So this article talks about a tipping toward a white minority. Even in our language, we approach this work with a systemically white frame. And when we are not mindful of the language that we're using, again, it can continue to project the notion of othering to people who don't identify as white. All right, take a deep breath with me. Okay, so now let's actually get into what it is that we're doing that's causing these issues and how we fix it. So the number one reason that I see time and time again environmental organizations not be able to progress and implement change is that they're relying on good intent. Typically, when someone tells us we have dirt on our face, what's our normal response? Gosh, and thank you for telling me that, right? But for some reason, when we are told that, hey, you know, I don't think you meant this that way, but what you actually said was actually pretty racist, or what you said was ableist or sexist, right? Or classist. What's the first thing we do? Me? I'm a good person. I would never. How could you say that, right? We go into defending ourselves rather because we think that being a good person is this fixed immutable trait. In reality, being a good person is like the bare minimum that we need to like be a contributing member of society, right? Like that's like a C minus, whatever the going rate is for passing these days in school. So in Green 2.0, when Dr. Taylor surveyed, I believe, over 300 different environmental organizations, she found that 75% of those organizations claim that diversity matters to them. And of course, here I am wondering, like, what's up with the other, percent? But only 49% of those organizations said that they would be likely to support or even take action to develop more inclusive practices and programs that would create more equitable career pathways. So unless we actually implement strategic practices and programs to not only select and attract and develop the people within our organizations, we're probably not going to keep them. So that's number one. Number two is that it's not enough to simply think that racism is bad. We have to be actively anti-racist. We have to be actively anti-sexist, anti-ableist, anti-discriminatory. And not just because this feels good or it's the nice thing to do. There's actually financial connections to this. McKinsey did a study where they found that gender diverse organizations are 15% more likely to financially outperform their non-gender diverse counterparts. Organizations that were ethnically diverse were 35% more likely to financially outperform their non-ethnically diverse counterparts. And yet, still, even with this knowledge, 97% of organizations fail to have a senior leadership that is representative of our US labor force. So let's talk about why that is. We don't recruit outside the club, right? The first thing we do when we've got a position open is we seek someone out from UW-Stevens Point or some other far north, place. And not hating on Stevens Point, I try to get a lot of my core members to go there. I personally think it's one of the best natural resource schools in the country. But we have to keep in mind that Stevens Point has a diversity rate of about 4%. So we have to ask ourselves, do the organizations that we're trying to partner with even have the diversity to give? Mind you, people of color represent about 38% of our nation's population, and that number is rising. Here in Wisconsin, Blacks actually only hold 4% of managerial and executive leadership positions, and that's data through the the Bureau of Labor. So I love my fleece too. It keeps me nice and warm. But we kind of have this notion where we send nonverbal cues to people that say you belong and you don't belong, right? So just being mindful of, what sort of image are you presenting to the world? And I'm not saying you should lie and put a bunch of colorful faces on your websites if that's not who you are, but being very transparent about where you're trying to go and about what you may not have and how you think you could benefit with folks. And by all means, please do not go into communities of color trying to extract information from them. If you're going to seek out information or service into your organization, think about how you can compensate people. Because more often than not, people of color are often asked to join an organization, and then, because they're interested in environmentalism or natural resource management, and when they get in, it's kind of like this gotcha, yeah, and can you also tell us about ourselves and make sure that if we say something that's going to get us in trouble, you check us. That's a lot of weight, and that person may not have signed up for that. So third is that we haven't created pathways. I firmly believe that genius is equally distributed, but access is not. And so if we are looking for talent that looks a certain way, sounds a certain way, comes with a certain resume, then are we truly valuing all ways of knowing? Are we truly making ourselves accessible? And lastly, as I kind of alluded to, you haven't cleaned house, right? So people usually reach out to me when they have a position that's open, or whether it's a board position, or they start a program and they want to again add some flavor into it. They were making a stir fry and they were like, oh right, dang it, we gotta get the cumin and the salt. Don't add people of color into your organization as an afterthought, right? I was just talking about this, with someone tonight, about how a lot of times nonprofit organizations will go and create these solutions in their little silos, and then they bring it out to the community, we're here to help. Are you really? So I kind of like this little caricature here. But it does, it really kind of expresses this notion that before we start looking to recruit people into our organization, we have to take a very critical lens to how we got here in the first place and start dismantling those practices and those policies, those unspoken cultures. Because diversity is not the goal, diversity is actually the outcome. It's the result of being an inclusive and an equitable organization. So just to recap, we want to set goals, not aspirations. We want to recruit outside the club. We want to create intentional pipelines, and we want to clean house. That's all I have.
Thank you very much, August. When I asked August to come here and speak to the group, she said, sure, I'll come, but I'm going to bring my friend Yamile Salgado. I thought, yes. Double bonus. I don't know how Yamile got my email address, but she invited me to come and talk to her class at Escuela Verde about backpacking. She's organized a backpacking program, and it was great fun. And anyway, just by way of introduction, Yamile is a student at Escuela Verde, And she was also named Student of the Year by the Wisconsin Association of Environmental Educators in 2018. And she's been and she told me tonight that she's going to be headed off to Northland College in September. She's going to tell us what she's going to talk about.
So at my school, we have our senior thesis that we had to work on our last year, and I decided that with that opportunity, I wanted to bring awareness to climate change with outdoor recreation in my school community, and specifically bringing in kids who didn't have that experience at all, either or don't know what backpacking is in general. And so I've been interested in outdoor recreation because of my first initial experience through the National School of Environmental Education, or
National Outdoor Leadership School.
there you go, it's NOLS, which honestly introduced me my freshman year. And so I got a scholarship through that. And it was my first experience ever being in the outdoors or learning about backpacking and all of that. So really it was somewhat overwhelming to be thrown out in the wild and just being able to learn the basics of backcountry camping and everything like that. But really what was mostly overwhelming for me was that there was a huge lack of representation for me there. And really, I feel like it was part of the whole experience being the only colored person in the group that I was in. And I think a couple barriers that I had through that was judgment, really, that came at me. The kids were really curious. I think our group was around seven kids, and I was the only colored kid in there. And so when I first went into the airport to meet everyone else, I was really excited, really open to the experience, and nobody talked to me. So we're just waiting for all the kids and all of that. And I feel like I'm usually the one to bring in conversation and talk to people, but it was just a huge new setting, and I really didn't know anybody or what I was doing, really. But throughout the whole trip, I gained connections with everybody and all of that. And one of the girls that was in there, she had come up to me and she said, "Oh, we didn't really talk to you at first because we didn't think you knew English." So for me, it was a bit of a shock that she actually came up and had the guts to tell me that. So I was like, okay, wow, like a lot of assumptions there. But really, it's not her fault that she didn't approach me because of that. But I feel like that was something that shocked me. Something like a small realization, really, that I wasn't really paying attention of was my presence being there and having that impact on others, and them being like scared to approach me because of that. But because of that experience and not having representation, I wanted to become that representation for myself in a way, which is why I'm pursuing outdoor education. I wanted to be the person that others can look up to and be like, yeah, I can relate to you because, you're brown and you've been through all these experiences and faced all these borders, but, you're here. And really, let's see. These experiences have really molded me to pursue a lot of more things that were environmentally oriented and kind of bringing my friends into it just because they were not aware that they can too be interested in the environment, and it's not like a white people thing to be outside or to be in the outdoors and stuff like that. Which initially is why I created the workshop, was really to bring my friends to the outdoors because it's something that they haven't really experienced. And then, let's see. So a couple of things that I feel like would have helped me in these experiences was obviously representation and people that I can relate to and connect with. And I know that throughout my trip, my advisor that was chosen, he brought it up to me. He was just saying that I know you are the only brown person here, and if you feel uncomfortable, if there's anything that I can help with, let me know. And I feel like that was something that really did help me throughout, because I did mention to him that that girl came up to me and was like, yeah, we didn't talk to you because we didn't think you do English. And I feel like it's good to know that, you know, situations like that have happened and that you can communicate to others about those situations to see what they can do to help that. Another thing is really to be like empathetic and understanding of our uncomfortableness and why we're uncomfortable, and not to like put it away or like shove it out and not pay attention to it, because I feel like that just like burdens it even more. And really just to have these conversations on diversity and intersectional diversity as well, to bring awareness to it, because in my trip, I feel like it was sort of a necessity to really talk about myself and who I am, because everybody was really interested as to who I was and like what my culture was and why am I brown and all of this stuff. So I was like, yeah, this is me and all this stuff. So I feel like it's really, really good to express who you are and your identity, so a lot of people are aware of it and you can see what they can do to really help. I feel like to really help themselves, but also the communities that they're in. But yeah, I feel like that's pretty much what I have. Does anybody have any overall questions?
Yeah, do you, how would you reach out to students who are of color to become part of backpacking? What would you do to make them interested in backpacking, which is a love of mine?
So for me, I always, when I came back from my backpacking trip, I decided to make a PowerPoint and share my experience and what I liked the most. And I feel like that instilled some sort of inspiration in people. So because of my workshop, I was interested in bringing people of color, because I feel like that was lacking in these outdoor spaces. And really, I wanted to tell them, like, be that representation, like, be out there, break that diversity. You can definitely do it. Like, it's not something that you're not able to do. So really, like, sharing my experience and how it impacted me and how it affected me, like, emotionally, and how I feel like my impact will impact others is something that I feel like will help others be more interested in us making that impact as well.
How did you arrive at your career and college choices?
So I'm actually double majoring in outdoor recreation and visual arts, because I'm an artist as well, and I felt that I was going to become an art teacher, but the environment was just like, boom, you gotta do this, like, you gotta be out there. So I was interested in outdoor education because I didn't think that it was an actual job. Like, I thought that you just had to be like an environmental educator and that's about it. I didn't think outdoor like leadership was a job out there. But then I was like, duh, like, I went on this trip, there was people who were leaving me that were paid to do this, like, and so I wanted to be them, but to be representation for myself, in a way.
Where did you go backpacking?
I went on a month-long expedition in Wyoming. Yeah. Yeah. So you can imagine why it was very overwhelming.
Yama, is it okay if I tell them how old you were and what you did to get to Grand Teton?
Yeah, go ahead.
So Yama was 14 years old. Had never been on a plane before, I don't think, right?
No.
Took a
Alone,
plane ride by
at least.
herself, alone, and then a train ride, I believe.
Yeah.
And her mom actually sat in my office, and I was trying to like convince her mom to please let your daughter do this. And as you can tell, Yamile is a very determined young woman and very confident. And I don't know which came first, but yeah. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I want to introduce Martha Berry as someone deeply committed to ending racism. She's a racial justice trainer, connector, bridge builder, and dedicated leader. Her social justice journey in California and Wisconsin led her to 15 years of work in corporate HR departments as trainer, leadership developer, and coach. Yeah, my sympathy. In her 12 years with YWCA in southeastern Wisconsin, has allowed her to hone her pursuit of racial justice and building community, creating curriculum, addressing racism, and advising nonprofit and business leaders on the next steps in their equity efforts. So, over to you, Martha.
How's everyone doing? You're being very much the troopers because it's a little toasty in here. Sort of as the evening goes on, you can feel it getting warmer. So thank you, David, for inviting me to join you all. I'm glad to be here and be a part of tonight. When we were talking through this, it was really a lot of fun to connect with August and Yamile before we were deciding what we were going to do, etc. And this is my passion in terms of getting people to look at race issues. And it's hard work for us as white people because we didn't grow up talking about race. We just didn't understand that there were differences. And, I often have people do an exercise, which I may make you do, which gives you an opportunity to go backwards and sort of look at what were the influences, what did you learn, not learn, et cetera, as a young person. But part of what I think is the hardest is that many of us are aware of the interpersonal racism that happens in situations where somebody says something that's really off and you are like feeling that awkward moment of, oh dear, what do I do? There's so many spaces that we're in as white people that we get paralyzed, and that doesn't make us bad people, but there's that paralyzing moment where we don't say anything, we witness something that's off, we don't say anything because we're afraid, and then we realize we're about 5 years old. And at that moment, we're back with our parents telling us to shut up, be seen, not heard, any message. And we can't sort of pull ourselves into our full adult selves to be the complete human being that we need to be at that moment to say this is really off and something needs to happen. And, so we could spend a whole workshop, as August was saying at various points, oh, that's a whole other workshop on that one, there's a whole other workshop on that. But the reality is, we're all really good people at those moments, but we're just stuck. We're stuck, we're stranded, we're whatever, and we can't come up with words or whatever. All of that is to say that there's a lot of work we have to do on ourselves to throw ourselves into situations where we're uncomfortable. And, I think August has given us a lot of things for us to think about in terms of here we are as these people that really care about the environment. We're doing amazing and important work, and we still look the way we do, and it's not, this hasn't shifted or that hasn't shifted. There are systems at play. And so the fact that she was talking about racially restrictive covenants, why do we not know about them? Why haven't we heard a lot of the history that would educate us on all kinds of systems that have made it possible for folks that look like me to advance and continue to advance? And, it's because that information is kept from us. And in being kept from us, we're allowed to keep ourselves naive to things and feeling innocent about what we do or don't know. And it puts us in a position where we then don't know that the systems have been put in place to keep certain people in power. And if we don't know about those systems, we don't know anything to challenge them. And it's just like that paralyzed moment where we don't know what to say. It's that same paralyzed, I don't even know where to begin. Like, I'm not sure what to do, etc. So I want to give you a few different ideas in terms of thinking about your life and how to diversify it, etc. But I thought it might be useful for people to just turn to the person next to them, and you're in rows of 5 in some cases, in places where you're in pairs. Because I want you to just take a minute, because there was a lot of really good information that both of them shared that's probably roaming around in your head and you're not sure how to connect all the dots. So I want to give people just a chance to turn and talk to one other person about what I heard and, you know, what dot connected in my head that I hadn't thought about or that I'm trying to make sense out of. Could be any number of things, right? Or I want to go back and talk to August about this, or Jamila, I got to ask more about that, whatever it might be. But the goal in this listening is that when the person is talking and you're listening, you don't ask any questions, you don't have any commentary, you got nothing to say because it's all about them.